Wait for the recording start. All right, so like I said, on Thursday, we were starting chapter 3. We introduced chapter 3, which we're heading east to India and Chickadee, China. All right, so the first section is mainly on India. And like chapter 2, there's 2 civilizations in this chapter are classified as cultural hearts. All right, they kind of the 2 of the 5 places where civilizations, early civilizations began. So in chapter 2, we talked about the Sumerians, Mesopotamia, and we talked about the Egyptians, right? Here in this chapter, the first cultural heart we talked about was the Indus Valley civilization, which is basically a name for a civilization that developed in what is primarily in Pakistan, around kind of like southwest, kind of like western part of India, on the Gujarat area, Uttar Pradesh. They refer to it simply as the Indus Valley civilization because the majority of those settlements were found along the Indus River, or into the Swati, kind of like river basins there. There's about 1,500 of them in all. 2 of them, the larger ones, Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, had populations of about 30 to 60,000 people, if you will. But we don't know exactly what they refer to themselves because there's a written language, yet there's no like Rosetta Stone to be able to decipher that. All right, and so what happened in this Valley civilization is somewhat debatable. They may have kind of migrated south after a major earthquake kind of shifted the direction of the Indus River, or they may have integrated with a culture that came from Central Asia called the Aryans. All right. And the Aryans left behind 2 things that still have kind of lasting impacts today. One is language, and then the other one is religion. Remember what they called that ancient language that they brought with them as language 0 for all Indo-European languages? It's called Sanskrit. All right. And so Sanskrit is essentially the kind of the mother language for languages such as Hindi and Gujarati, or like in India, in Urdu in Pakistan, Pashto in Afghanistan, Farsi in Iran, but also all the major European languages and language branches like Germanic and Romance and such. And the other one was religion. They brought with them that we developed into the religion of Hinduism, which is the 3rd largest religion of the 5 major world religions, right? And so Hinduism, like we're trying to explain, is significant because it does have a sacred text, all right, called the Vedas. All the 5 major world religions have a text that is important to basically outline their kind of their beliefs and their kind of their rituals and such like that. Hinduism is a little bit harder to get a grasp on from a Western perspective, from like kind of like true like kind of monotheistic traditions like Judeo-Christianity. There's multiple deities that are listed in the Rig Veda, the one book of the Vedas, but all of them have certain aspects of a kind of cosmic spirit called Brahman. All right. And then you have other kind of ancillary texts like the Upanishads, which lays out kind of how Hindus are supposed to live their life. There's important concepts like karma and dharma, right? How you act in the here and now will determine whether you're reincarnated in the concept of reincarnation into a dung beetle or somebody with great wealth and such. All right. Ultimately, you want to stop the cycle of transmigration of soul reincarnation by reaching a state called moksha. And then another ancillary text was the laws of Manu, which I gave you guys a worksheet on yesterday, which basically sets out the social structure within kind of society in India there. Now, all of these other civilizations we talked about develop classes, right? Basically based on the types of jobs that you do. All right. And same thing, all right, with here, but this is a little bit more tied into religion. So we talked about the top of the Brahmin. Those are the priests and scholars. Below them were the Kshatriyas. Those are the warriors and the rulers. And then you have the Vaishyas and the Shudras, the landowners, the merchants, the laborers and such. And each of them have subcastes. Now, like in the worksheet, they all kind of represent some aspect of the god Brahma. The Brahmin are the mouth. They're the ones who basically speak the religious truths. And then the Kshatriyas are the arms, so are the fighters. The Vaishyas are the thighs, and then the Shudras are the feet. Then over time, there develops a separate caste. It may have had its origins within the Shudras called the Dalit or the Harajans. Now, these are the people that often do the jobs like cremation of bodies for funeral purposes, all right, or more modern sense sanitation work. They do the jobs that are kind of somewhat deemed as maybe kind of unclean, if you will. All right. Now, the reason why I show you is that this system is still around today. All right. And I was saying, like in the United States, where basically this happened yesterday, kind of move on. In other parts of the world, events and kind of like structures that are put in place 3,000 years ago have ramifications today. So what I want to do is I want to show you this video before we get into the notes from 60 Minutes. It was the early 2000s, but talks about how the caste system still has ramifications today. All I ask you is that you watch this, all right, like I said, you may have seen 60 Minutes.
Earlier this year, in a rural part of India, armed men working for a group of landlords attacked farm workers, killing 22 of them. It was an all-too-ordinary event in rural India. As members of a high caste, the landowners exercise their control over the lowest caste, the workers, who don't seem to be able to do anything to stop it. Christian Amanpour of CNN, on special assignment for 60 Minutes, went to India to look into the plight of that lowest caste called the untouchables.
Of all the inhuman labels one human being can put on another, untouchable is about as bad as it gets. And of all the countries that should have long since done away with barbaric discrimination, it's India. The India of Mahatma Gandhi, whose struggle for human rights turned the country from a British colony into the world's largest democracy. But today, 200 million of India's 1 billion people are still considered so low, so unclean, that many of their countrymen won't even touch them or share the same water with them. Their only crime? Being born at the bottom of an ancient Hindu hierarchy that divides everyone along rigid social lines called castes. Sometimes the smallest detail can reveal the whole picture. These untouchable villagers are taking their shoes off, not because they want to, but because they have to. They're about to pass their upper caste neighbors, sitting here in the shade. It's a daily ritual of petty humiliation. The untouchables can only wear their shoes again when they reach their own part of town. Why are you guys always taking off your shoes and putting them back on again?
If we don't take our shoes off, we'll be fired from our jobs. We'd like to stand up to them, but we know we don't have a chance.
Have you ever been punished for anything here?
They've punished us several times. We have to fall at their feet 2 or 3 times.
They have to fall at their feet?
We have to lie on the ground and beg forgiveness.
Oh my goodness. And the discrimination continues at prayer. Untouchables aren't allowed to enter the Hindu temple in this village, so the priest blesses them outside. In tea houses all over India, untouchables have to drink from separate glasses. And they have to wait until someone comes to serve them outside. Even access to clean water is determined according to caste. Untouchables can't use this public well because even their touch would pollute the water, says this upper caste villager.
These customs have been practiced forever, and if the government passed new laws against it, nothing would change, and I personally don't believe it should.
This is where Rangama, an untouchable woman, was forced to get her water. A muddy pond polluted by animal feces. Rangama's encounter with a pig proves just how dirty this water is. Did a lot of people get sick from drinking the bad water? Yes. And when our children became sick, the doctors blamed us, saying you people are unclean. After enduring years of this kind of discrimination, Rangama and her friends took up the fight. It began with a small act of defiance. One day, they decided to take clean water from the public well, but they were stopped by infuriated upper caste villagers, and even worse, their own husbands were too afraid to support their cause.
All the women in the village, we decided that if our men didn't help us get clean water, we wouldn't cook for them. And so, 4 days later, they joined our fight.
Rangama and her friends created such an uproar that eventually the upper caste in this village were forced to back down.
Now we have clean water, and water is life.
The caste system is as old as the stones that built this temple. India's segregation is cemented in nearly 3,000 years of religion, not law. It's one of the most
complicated, sophisticated systems of social hierarchy and oppression that the human beings have ever devised.
Professor Sunil Kilnani teaches politics at the University of London. He's the author of an acclaimed book on contemporary India and the complex legacy of the caste system. It's a system that ranks every Hindu from the highest to the lowest according to the work they and their caste perform.
Purity is an extremely important facet of religious observance. For example, the use of fire, which is very common in Hindu rituals, or the use of water. There's a very strong sense of certain objects, certain things being taboo, that you don't come into contact with them.
For instance, the dead. Traditionally, it's the untouchables who prepare the corpses for cremation.
They were those castes who performed the work that no one else in the society would do, such as dealing with the bodies of the dead, etc. This was seen as work that somehow was profaning, that was impure.
The untouchables are considered so unclean that traditionally not even their shadows were supposed to defile these temples, and today they are still relegated to the very worst that life has to offer. Like Narayanama, she's been using her bare hands to clean public toilets for the past 19 years.
They look down at me, and it hurts my soul.
Narayanama's family has been assigned this filthy job for generations, and for generations it's made them physically ill.
No one has ever offered me water when I'm thirsty, and when I want to wash my face, I have to use another well.
Even though 6 years ago the Indian government banned this practice, today about 1 million untouchables still do this job, and ironically, Narayanama's employer is the city government.
No, I don't like this. I don't want this job. I would leave it if they gave me another one.
As long as toilets need cleaning, streets need sweeping, and the trash needs to be carted away, the job will be assigned to the untouchables. In big cities, they may escape the abuses they endured in the small villages, but often their only choice will be to settle in slums, where no one else would even think of living. Henry Tiffine is a local human rights worker.
Oh, good Lord. Is this the toilet river?
Do you see the man walking across it?
Yeah. He's walking basically through an open
Yeah,
sewer.
open sewer. It's all open sewer.
Kids are playing in this sewer.
That's normal. That's normal.
That's normal.
That's normal here.
That's normal for untouchable.
And these are the sanitary workers of the town.
The sanitary workers of the town.
What, the people who clean the
Who
latrines
clean the
and things?
latrines, who clean the streets.
Now that is truly disgusting, the latrine business. I mean, how people can accept to clean public toilets with their hands is beyond me.
And increasingly, India's 200 million untouchables are resisting through the power of the ballot and political protest. And it's changing the face of India.
Caste as a form of social imprisonment is beginning to break down, I think. It's beginning to break down. People are beginning to assert their rights. They are beginning to say, well, look, constitutionally, this is illegitimate. These are my rights as an Indian citizen.
They are rights that were enshrined in India's constitution, which banned discrimination against untouchables. Progress has been difficult, but now, for the first time in history, an untouchable has managed, through his own efforts, to become president of India, though the office is largely symbolic. But it's the local untouchable leaders like Dr. Krishna Swami who are really shaking up the system by building a political movement on centuries of pent-up anger.
Is India a democracy for all?
No, it is a fake democracy. We are fighting for our self-respect.
Some local officials have been killed. Are you not afraid?
There are thousands and thousands of people are ready for this fight.
But the upper caste is fighting back. These young men are furious at the Indian government for increasing the number of sought-after civil service jobs that the government reserves for untouchables. It's India's own war over quotas and affirmative action.
What's at stake is I think, whether the upper castes are going to continue to maintain their privileged positions, or whether they're going to have to cede some room and some place to those from the lower castes who want a slice of the cake, really.
Almost every time untouchables assert their rights, it provokes violence in the cities and especially in the countryside, where upper caste landlords still reign over their untouchable laborers. That's what happened in the village of B.C-A.D one night.
More than 200 upper caste men, armed with guns and knives, attacked this village. They went from hut to hut, killing anyone they could find, even children. And all these villagers had been asking for was what they considered a fair wage, $1 worth of rice a day for their work in the fields.
This is what they got for their trouble: unspeakable horror. The bodies of 58 villagers haphazardly sprawled where their killers found them. Whole families were murdered, including Parwati Devi's son and his wife. Only her grandson survived, hidden in his dead mother's dress.
There was no reason to kill my son. He never argued with anyone. Like all of us, he just worked in the fields for his daily wage.
A pittance of a wage paid by the landlords who own these fields and who now are accused of leading the slaughter. Mohan Chaudhry is the upper caste village priest.
We never start the violence. It's the untouchables who pick the fight. And the landlords just retaliate.
So in this part of India, untouchables are arming themselves. Only women are allowed in this militia. They're being trained to shoot because they are most at risk.
Nobody else will protect us. That's why I carry my own gun. Recently, a young girl was kidnapped and raped by the landlords. There's more violence every day, and the police don't help us.
Sister Sudha is trying to help, but she uses the law. She's an attorney and a Catholic nun who chooses to live with and defend the very lowest castes.
When you see untouchables, men or women, cleaning human excrement with their hands, being forced to drink from separate cups in tea rooms, having to take off their shoes when they walk past an upper caste, is there a sense of outrage?
For sure. It's really a curse on humanity. The whole caste system.
Is there any escape?
Impossible. See, in India, everyone knows his caste.
So no matter how well you do in life, you will always be considered an untouchable,
Yes,
unclean,
yes,
and less than human.
right.
The untouchables' burden has been carried from generation to generation. Now, Narayanama, the toilet cleaner, pleads that it not be passed on any further.
All I'm begging for is that my children don't inherit this job. It should end with me.
What does the government say about all of this? They don't want to talk about it.
All right, so like I said, it still kind of exists today, although not in law, but custom. All right. South Asia is also the home of another major world religion, of the 5 major world religions, that's Buddhism. All right, and so Buddhism has its origins in the 6th to 5th century BC. The founder of the religion is a guy named Siddhartha Gautama. All right, Siddhartha was a member of the Kshatriya caste. All right, so much kind of like how Christianity takes some certain tenets from Judaism, kind of stems out of its founder. There was Jesus was Jewish. Same thing with kind of like Buddhism from Hinduism. All right, Siddhartha Gautama was a Hindu. Now, according to legend, Siddhartha Gautama was this good-looking dude. He was a prince. His father was basically a small kingdom in what is now modern-day Nepal. All right. 29 years old. He had everything going for him. He had a beautiful wife. Just had a son. However, he was somewhat sheltered and never really left the palace, kind of like palace walls. So he went outside the palace walls and saw three things that kind of like blew his mind. One, he saw kind of a poor man begging. Two, he saw another man feeble and old, kind of like with a cane, and then he saw another man on the side of the road dying. And essentially he started to question things. So at the age of 29, he left his family and he went out to become an ascetic. Basically, somebody who went out and kind of like basically meditated, lived off of charity from others and such. He was so emaciated that he said, according to legend, that he could put his finger to his stomach and touch his spine. All right, and then one day he's out meditating, like under a banyan tree. This banyan tree that he meditated for numerous times. He touches his finger to the ground, and it all comes to him. He becomes enlightened. He becomes the Buddha. All right, and so there's certain tenets of Buddhism that take from Hinduism, like karma and dharma and reincarnation and stuff. All right, Buddha, like there's some similarities with Jesus in the sense that both of them have numerous kind of images in their honor. With Buddha, the images differ based on time frame and location. So in South Asia, in India, and that in Sri Lanka, if you see an image of Buddha, it tends to be more spelt like Buddha. All right. As you go east into China, Korea, Japan, you see the more heavier kind of Buddha that people in the West are kind of familiar with. That's mainly from the kind of like the Eastern kind of school. Every kind of major Buddhist country tends to have a statue that they claim is the largest Buddha. And like this one is in Thailand. This is the largest reclining Buddha of this Buddhist temple here, which is made in gold. All right, now Buddha, like a lot of kind of religious figures, has an interesting kind of origin story. According to legend, he was born from the side of his mother. All right, that is related to in a dream. His mother was basically the god Ganesh, who the elephant-headed god basically came to her in a dream and pierced her side, all right, with an ivory tusk. Needless to say, his mother dies in childbirth, which giving birth in the ancient world can be pretty dangerous. His father was told that his son would either be a great military leader or a great religious leader, so that's why he tried to isolate him from becoming a religious leader. All right, but ultimately that's what he is. And so in Buddhism, and we'll talk about later, like different schools and sects and denominations. What you have here is this thing called the Four Noble Truths that basically are the core foundations of Buddhism. And the Four Noble Truths are kind of like an infomercial for the faith, if you will. In a sense, the first noble truth is that everything in life is suffering and sorrow. All right, that sounds like you probably not be too fun to be around with the parties and stuff. All right, now why do you suffer? Why do you have sorrow? It's because you want stuff, your desire for material wealth. All right, and what this does is causes like basically suffering in you, sorrow in you, where you become tunnel vision for acquiring these things. You lose your true self, but also could be suffering for others because you can hurt people in that process, whether it's to acquire wealth or power or both to a certain extent, right? So the third truth is basically, so what do you do about that? The third one is that you end all suffering and all that by just ending the desires for wanting that stuff. Now that's easier said than done, right? Okay? If you know any of the family members that try to quit smoking or whatever, maybe to do that cold turkey can be difficult. And the Buddha is aware of this, all right? That this just can't be it. So here's the fourth truth. That's basically the payoff here. You can overcome these desires, you can overcome these sorrows, and then also attain enlightenment by following something called the Eightfold Path. The Eightfold Path is like a step program on how to become enlightened. All right, and so the Buddha was I'll basically kind of lay that out, and by following that kind of like his suggestions here, you will ultimately obtain enlightenment and ultimately reach that goal where you end the cycle of reincarnation. All right. So the Eightfold Path, you don't need to write this down. The Eightfold Path is basically this idea you basically improve yourself. It's basically self-improvement through right knowledge, speech, action, purpose, mindfulness, and a lot of this stuff tends to be kind of vague, if you will. But a lot of this is done through meditation, which the Buddha did. And so ultimately, your goal is to reach this state, nirvana. This is the Buddhist state of ultimate peace. Ends the cycle of reincarnation. Very similar to moksha in that sense. Now later, as the religion kind of develops, we start to see different like sects and denominations. There's Theravada Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, and that. And within like Mahayana Buddhism, Buddha is elevated from one who was like a philosopher and that to maybe one who was a deity to a certain extent. And then the concept of nirvana takes a more heaven-like concept, if you will. Now, there's other people that are going to kind of like who look like Buddha. If you ever go to a Chinese restaurant and see a little statue, like we said, that may not be Buddha. That may be a bodhisattva Buddha, which are the kind of like these individuals that are Buddha-like. They basically hold off obtaining nirvana to help others people become enlightened. They're like saints to a certain extent. All right. Now, but in reality, when the Buddha dies by the kind of late part of the 5th century, this is not a large religion. This is a kind of a small sect. And there's some similarities with the Buddha and Jesus. He has a number of followers, disciples. A lot of his stuff is saying he basically, people come see him do sermons and all this other stuff. But it's still overwhelmingly Hindu in this area. Politically speaking, all right, this is also a transition for India where we see kind of foreigners kind of come into the area to stake claims, in particularly Western India and Pakistan. We talked about the Persians last chapter, under Darius or Darius the Great, establishing a presence in Afghanistan, Pakistan, very small parts of Western India. Persians are defeated by the Greeks. The Macedonians and the Greeks led by Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great, that's the farthest extent he goes of his empire. As a matter of fact, after the battles in India, his men insisted on basically heading back, all right? Mainly because, and he kept some there. Those who stayed on were referred to as Seleucids, named after a general named Seleucus, who was one of his top generals after Alexander dies of fever of Babylon. His empire is divided amongst his top generals. We talked about Ptolemy last chapter, all right? So the Seleucids are mainly based in Babylon, but they control this area here, all right? However, the Seleucids only have a brief control in India because there was a young kid, that had witnessed Alexander's army kind of moving into India, right? And he eventually is going to kind of become the Alexander of South Asia, and that's Chandragupta Maurya. And he establishes the first native Indian empire in the region called the Mauryan Empire. Chandragupta is going to defeat the Seleucids. Matter of fact, the Seleucid king at the time, a guy named Nestor, actually gives one of his daughters to Chandragupta to solidify the treaty. And then he defeats all these other kind of smaller Indian states in the area, and controls most of India with the exception of very far southern part there. With his help of his minister, Kuntuya, a guy who's often referred to as Vishnu Gupta, they're going to establish a form of government that is very authoritarian, very autocratic, a lot of use of torture, violence, intimidation. Chandragupta, as a result, was a little paranoid. Right? There's legend that he never slept in the same bed 2 nights in a row. He had people tasting his food. All right. There's him and his main minister, Vishnu Gupta, and this is the area that they control. Like I said, extended into Pakistan, into Afghanistan. One area that was basically kind of free from Chandragupta's control was a state called Kalinga, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. Right? However, at one point, Chandragupta kind of has a change of heart. He actually converts to Jainism, that very kind of extreme version of kind of an offshoot of Hinduism of nonviolence. I showed you that symbol of the swastika. That was the symbol of Jainism. He leaves his son Bindusarya in control and retreats to a mountain where he eventually meditates and then starves himself to death through the process of trying to become enlightened. Right? Bindusarya maintains many aspects that his father had laid out for the empire. And then when Bindusarya dies, his son Ashoka comes to the throne. Now, Ashoka was kind of like his grandfather, had initially had a reputation of being particularly cruel. And that's what they referred to him as Ashoka the Cruel. In one legend, he had 99 half-brothers. His father had multiple wives that he killed after his father died to become king. All right. One legend, the only brothers he spared were his full brothers. Then he killed 500 of his father's ministers to make sure that they wouldn't usurp power. He used torture. All right. He was obsessed with conquering that state of Kalinga. All right. There's an image of Ashoka. And then at one point, after they battle with the state of Kalinga, he has what alcoholics refer to as a moment of clarity. Right. According to the legend, after the battle, in one legend states there was 1 million casualties, which is probably a little bit over exaggeration, but there was a lot. A Buddhist monk came to him carrying the body of a dead child who had died and who basically got caught in the crossfire. and basically kind of put in front of Ashoka's face his kind of consequences there. And Ashoka starts to basically kind of immerse himself into Buddhist teachings. So what he does is basically does a complete 180, and it has the government based on Buddhist principles. He issues what's called these edicts, these public announcements, these pillars and stones that are put up, basically talking about how, and the government was basically kind of based on Buddhist principles. There were some progressive ideas, like giving women the right to be educated, taking care of the poor and the sick, creating hospitals and stuff like that, not slaughtering certain animals and stuff. But this creates a 180. Now, what it does is help the religion become one that's not just a sect from Hinduism, but basically a full-blown religion. And he helps spread the religion throughout India. He even sends missionaries as far west as Greece. All throughout the area, he kind of puts these edicts up there. At the top of each edict, you would have the 3 lions that represented the Mauryan Empire. In the middle here is the chakra. The chakra was like kind of this wheel that was initially kind of a weapon that was later used for kind of spinning wealth and stuff, and it signifies the kind of the eightfold path. Today, the modern day flag of India has that chakra in the middle of it, and that's associated with Ashoka. Ashoka represented to certain Indians during the kind of the independence movement, somebody who kind of was somebody to be respected. These are the various pillars. This is one just north of New Delhi. This one has various kind of Buddhist prayer flags next to it. All right. And there's multiple languages that are on these. This is like a form of Sanskrit. This is Aramaic, which was the language that was spoken by Jesus in the Quran. There's inscriptions that have Greek on there. He's trying to address all the people that live within this realm, right? And he built some of the first Buddhist temples called stupas, which were essentially supposed to be like bowls flipped over. The bowl represented the ascetic. And some of these stupas, although lost in history, claim to have relics of the Buddha, remains of the Buddha there, all right? Unfortunately, though, after Ashoka dies, within 50 years, the empire falls apart. Mainly because he kind of set on a pattern there where one is like basically kind of demilitarized to a certain extent. And then his successors were somewhat weak. And so all these states they basically had conquered, starting with his grandfather, start to break apart. All right. And then you have like invaders from various parts of the Near East there. They're kind of establishing their own states and kingdoms. All right. It's not for another 500 years, which we'll talk about on Thursday, what they would see the Guptas, which are no relation to Chandragupta and the golden age of kind of Indian history that basically kind of re-established the central power in India. All right. So that's what we'll talk about on Thursday. I'm going to send you tomorrow just a worksheet from that minister, that Quintaya guy who was often referred to as Vishnu Gupta, talking about the style of governments that the Mauryans had.